The shift supervisor had already warned me twice about my expression. Apparently, grief isn't professional when you're holding a suction tube and a parent's hope in your hand simultaneously. I wasn't trying to look miserable. Misery was just the default setting at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday when you've watched a 7-year-old's chest stop moving despite everything you did to restart it. Sarah Vega, not her real name, but I call them all different names in my head so I don't carry them home in the exact shape they arrived, had been admitted for what should have been routine. Appendicitis. Her mother brought her in at 6 in the evening. By 9, infection had progressed in ways that shouldn't have been possible. By 11, she was gone. Pediatric nurses learn early that attachment is a luxury we can't afford. You develop distance like armor. You make jokes between trauma. You go home and pretend that 8 hours of someone else's devastation doesn't live in your ribcage. That night, the armor had holes. The break room was empty, except for the vending machine's electronic hum and the fluorescent fixture that had been flickering for months. No one had bothered to replace it. Things didn't get maintained around here unless they directly prevented someone from dying. A faulty light was cosmetic damage in a building full of human ones. I was trying to wash blood from under my fingernails. Hers, transferred during the procedure that failed to save her. When my phone started vibrating inside my locker. Once. Twice. 3 times in rapid succession. Like someone was determined to pull me out of my own head whether I wanted to leave or not. Unknown number. In general, calls from unknown numbers at midnight fall into predictable categories. Scammers. Drunk friends using backup phones. Hospital overflow calling staff for emergency shifts. I almost didn't answer. Almost just let it ring itself tired and die unanswered like everything else in my life seemed to be doing. On the 3rd vibration, I picked up. Hello? The woman's voice that came through was constructed. Professional in that particular architecture that meant someone had trained her to sound this way. Not cold, but not warm either. Precisely calibrated. Ms. Cooper? Madison Cooper? Who's calling? My hand was still wet. I was dripping onto the break room floor, leaving small dark spots that looked like evidence of something I wasn't ready to examine. My name is Rosa. I work as a personal assistant for a family in Chicago. I understand you work in pediatric care at Mercy General Hospital, specifically in emergency pediatric services. The way she said it, with the specificity of someone who had researched extensively, made my shoulders tighten. How did you get this number? That isn't the priority right now. What is priority is that we have a situation involving 2 infants who require specialized attention. Your name was brought to us by someone we trust, someone familiar with your reputation in pediatric care. I sat on the break room bench, leaving the wet spots behind. I don't do private work. If your family needs medical attention, there are hospitals. It's not medical attention in the traditional sense that they need. Not entirely. Rosa paused, and I could hear ambient noise behind her voice. Traffic, voices, the sound of somewhere more alive than this fluorescent limbo. The twins are Mateo and Julia. They're 10 months old. They lost their mother 3 months ago to a sudden septic shock from an undiagnosed infection following childbirth. Sepsis. Rapid onset. Despite emergency intervention, I stopped moving. There was something about the way she delivered those facts, like a briefing rather than a tragedy, that made me listen differently. Since their mother. My mother touched the pantry shelves like they were museum glass. They trusted you to arrange all this? They trusted me to make ordinary happen, I said. She looked at her hands. No chemical burns, no fresh cuts. Then at me. You said once you'd buy me time. I was late, I told her. But I brought change. She nodded. Change is better than flowers. Death, Rosa continued. The children have experienced severe sleep disturbance, not typical infant sleep patterns. This is different. Chronic insomnia, episodes of panic that have required hospitalization. Twice, due to dehydration and failure to maintain adequate nutrition. Pediatricians have been consulted. Sleep specialists. Medications have been prescribed and adjusted. Nothing has resolved the underlying issue. That sounds like grief response, I said. That's normal for children who've experienced loss. They process trauma differently than adults do. Exactly. which is why pediatricians cannot help them. The problem isn't medical, it's emotional. Your reputation in pediatric circles, particularly your work with children who have experienced loss or trauma, has made your name relevant to our situation. I almost laughed. The break room was still humming with its broken light. I was still wearing Sarah's blood under my fingernails. The idea that someone thought I had answers for anything felt absurd. I appreciate the call, but I don't take private consultations. My work is here. The family would pay $20,000 for 2 hours of your time. The number hung in the air between us like something physical. 20,000. That was 3 times what I made monthly at the hospital. That was more money than my mother had earned in entire years of working as a housekeeper. That was a fantasy number. That's not a reasonable offer, I said carefully. It's their opening position. The amount is negotiable upward, if necessary. We would arrange transportation tomorrow morning. You would spend the day with the children, provide assessment and recommendations. After that, your involvement ends unless you choose otherwise. There was something in how she said it, the precision, the respect in offering an exit, that made me take her seriously instead of hanging up. Why me specifically? There are other pediatric specialists in Chicago. Your reputation precedes you. The work you do with traumatized children. The way you separate the patient from circumstances. The way you focus on what can be fixed rather than what broke them. Our family needs someone who can see the children themselves, not their situation. I was quiet. In the break room, someone had left a patient chart on the table. I could see Sarah's name from where I was sitting. Could see the timeline of deterioration mapped out in clinical notation. 8 hours from admission to death. 32 minutes from point of no return to actual no return. I need to think about it, I heard myself say. Of course. I'll call again in exactly 1 hour. If you choose to proceed, I'll arrange everything. If not, we'll never contact you again. Either way, thank you for taking the call, Ms. Cooper. She hung up. I sat in that break room for 43 minutes. I didn't move, didn't wash my hands, didn't leave. I just sat and looked at Sarah's chart and thought about the fact that I had failed her. Failed her completely. That for all my reputation and training and accumulated experience, I couldn't save a 7-year-old girl who should have been alive to complain about homework on Friday. I thought about my mother, who at 62 was still working as a housekeeper in other people's homes along Lakeshore Drive and up into the North Shore. She could barely afford her own apartment despite me paying her rent. Who could barely afford her own apartment despite me paying her rent. Who had raised me alone after my father disappeared and had done it with hands that cleaned other people's homes for 14 hours a day. I thought about the fact that I still hadn't made enough money to let her retire. That I was 31 years old and still failing at the basic promise of making her life easier. I thought about 2 babies who were living in a world where their mother had simply ceased to exist. My phone buzzed at exactly 1 hour. I answered before it could ring a second time. I'll do it, I said to Rosa. Excellent. We'll send a car at 7 in the morning. The driver will have your name. Bring only what you need for 1 day of consultation. Who is the father? I asked. You mentioned the family, but never said who they are. There was a pause. The kind of pause that meant Rosa was deciding how much to tell me. His name is Diego Fioraldi. I knew the name. Not from medical circles or social contexts, from news cycles, from casual references people made in hospital hallways when they thought no one important was listening. Fioraldi, the name that appeared in articles about organized crime that were written carefully enough to avoid lawsuits. The kind of name attached to money that didn't appear on tax returns. The kind of name that suggested empires built in the spaces between legality and necessity. I'm aware of his reputation, I said quietly. What matters, Rosa replied, is that he has 2 children who need care. Everything else is background noise. Can you separate the 2? I didn't answer immediately. Could I? I'd spent my entire career learning to separate patient from circumstance. To see the child and not the parents. To focus on what I could fix and not worry about the machinery that broke them. Yes, I said. I can do that. She gave me an address in a part of Chicago that I'd never been to. Told me the car would arrive at 7. Told me the driver would have my name. Told me to bring only what I needed. I went home to my apartment that was barely bigger than a closet, packed a bag with my professional documents and a change of clothes and the small notebook where I keep observations about pediatric cases, sat on my bed in the darkness, and tried not to think about what I was walking toward. At 4 a.m., I was still awake, still fully dressed, still trying to process the fact that I had agreed to something I didn't understand. The darkness outside my window matched something inside my chest. A door opening to somewhere I wasn't ready to go but couldn't avoid anymore. The car arrived at 7, exactly. Black, tinted windows, driver in dark clothes who didn't introduce himself. He just nodded when I got in and drove in silence toward the part of Chicago I'd never been to. The kind of silence that made every minute feel longer than it should. Lakeshore Drive mansions passed by in increasing size and decreasing accessibility. Gates grew higher. Properties grew wider. The wealth here wasn't decorative, it was defensive. These weren't homes meant to impress. They were fortresses built by people who understood that having things meant having to keep them. The driver turned onto a private road I wouldn't have found on any map. Stone walls lined both sides, cameras at intervals that didn't pretend to be anything but security. Men stood in positions that looked casual until you realized they were strategically placed. They watched the car pass without expression. We pulled up to a gate that was less gate and more statement. Iron. Imposing. The kind of thing that made clear boundaries without needing to speak them aloud. It opened without the driver touching anything, which meant someone was watching us from somewhere I couldn't see. The driveway wound through manicured grounds that looked like they'd been designed by someone who understood aesthetics as control. Nothing was wild. Nothing was unexpected. Everything was arranged exactly as intended. The mansion appeared gradually through trees that had probably been planted a century ago. It was white, 3 stories. Architecture that suggested old money pretending to be restrained, but failing at the pretense through sheer scale. Columns. Marble visible even from the car. The kind of place where every detail cost more than my annual salary. Rosa was waiting at the entrance. She was exactly as her voice suggested. Professional. Constructed. A woman in her late 50s or early 60s with gray-threaded dark hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. She wore clothes that were expensive in a way that was meant to be invisible, quality that spoke only to people who understood such things. She smiled when she saw me, but it was a scheduled smile. A smile that had been practiced. Ms. Cooper. Welcome. I'm Rosa. We spoke on the phone last night. I shook her hand. It was cool. Controlled. Thank you for arranging everything. Of course. Come inside. I'll show you around briefly, then introduce you to the children. The interior of the mansion was what I'd expected, and nothing like what I'd expected simultaneously. Expensive, yes. But cold. There were no photographs of people on the walls. Only art that looked like it belonged in a museum. No soft furniture. No signs of actual living. It was a gallery someone inhabited. Rosa guided me through corridors that seemed designed to intimidate through their length. Marble floors, high ceilings, everything echoing with a quality of emptiness despite being full. The twins are in the nursery, Rosa explained as we walked. Matteo and Julia, they're 10 months old. The children lost their mother approximately 3 months ago due to a sudden septic shock from an undiagnosed infection following childbirth. Sepsis. Rapid onset despite medical intervention. I was listening but also absorbing the space. There was something about moving through this house that made grief feel heavier, like the emptiness was a weight you could carry. Since then, Rosa continued, the children have experienced significant sleep disturbance. Not typical infant sleep challenges. This is sustained insomnia, panic episodes that have required hospitalization. The pediatricians have been thorough but unable to resolve the underlying issue. She stopped at a closed door. They're this way. The first night I wrote rules I knew I would break. I listed them on the back of a grocery receipt, the cheap paper going translucent where my thumb pressed. No rocking past 5 minutes. No feeding to sleep. No new stimuli after 9. The babies had not read any of the literature. They negotiated with breath and whimpers, and the kind of protest that is half language and half weather pattern. I timed transitions with the silent second hand of the oven clock and counted the way a NICU nurse once taught me. Not from the cry, but from the return of the shoulder to baseline. Recovery is the true interval. Diego stood once in the doorway, shirt open and tie gone, the gold chain a dull crescent. He didn't make the mistake of asking if he could help. I handed him a folded blanket. "Hold this," I said, and he held it like contraband until I pointed to the far corner, our controlled shadow, where light pooled without touching the crib. When both infants downshifted into the slack-jaw state that looks like peace, but is just the first stage of sleep, he exhaled. I kept my exhale for later. I have learned not to spend relief before it matures. At 3:17, the house sighed in old wood in winter. I pressed 2 fingers along the top rail of the crib to provide the smallest resistance, the exact ounces that tell a body it is not falling. Presence, not intervention. Outside, a patrol car idled at the end of the lane where the cameras could see it and the children could not. I thought of Sarah Vega and the one night we lost a baby because we tried to meet a standard instead of a person. "Your standard is the child," she told me later. "Write it down. Forget the rest." I did. On the back of a receipt, where real rules live. By dawn, the receipt had an oil stain. Where Diego set a plate he didn't realize was still buttered. "We'll frame it," he said, too tired to know if he joked. "We'll laminate it," I corrected. The kind of humor you make when the worst thing did not happen. The nursery was the first room I'd seen that looked like an actual space where children lived. It was still expensive, I could see that. But there was clutter here. Toys. A changing table with supplies. 2 separate cribs positioned near each other but not touching. 1 small lamp shaped like a moon. The room was trying to be a place of comfort and failing, because nothing here could hide the fundamental absence. 2 babies were in the cribs. Mateo and Julia. Not sleeping. Just lying there. When they saw Rosa enter, something shifted in their bodies. Subtle, but present. Recognition without comfort. Mateo was on the left. Julia on the right. Both had dark hair, olive skin, features that indicated their Italian heritage. Their eyes were dark, almost black. But what struck me most wasn't their appearance. It was the quality of their alertness. These were babies who had learned to stay vigilant. Babies who understood something was wrong, even if they couldn't articulate what that something was. "Madison Cooper," Rosa said formally. "These are Matteo and Giulia Fioraldi." I approached the crib slowly. Not the way most people approach babies, with that performative energy and exaggerated expressions. I just approached them like I was approaching 2 small humans who deserved to be treated like that. "Hello," I said quietly. To them. Just to them. Julia made a small sound. Not quite crying. Not quite anything else. Just a sound that indicated she knew I was there. I spent the next hour simply observing. Not touching. Not forcing interaction. Just existing in the same space. And letting them become accustomed to my presence. I watched how they moved. How they responded to sounds. How Mateo seemed to need physical reassurance, while Julia seemed to need verbal acknowledgement. I watched how they reached for each other when they were distressed. Babies communicate trauma in ways that are often invisible to people who don't know what they're looking for. Elevated heart rates. Changes in digestive function. Difficulty transitioning between states. Hypervigilance that manifests as reduced sleep. These 2 showed all of it. I was taking notes when the door opened. He filled the space before I even registered that he was there. Not because he was loud or aggressive, but because his presence had weight. Diego Fioraldi. The name came with a reputation I'd tried not to think about on the drive here. Now it had a face. He was tall, approximately 6'2". Dark hair, black or nearly black, with threads of gray visible at the temples. He wore a suit that was tailored in a way that suggested the tailor had been very expensive. His eyes were brown, but not warm brown. The kind of brown that looked like it had seen things that changed its color. There was a scar on his right cheek. A thin line that looked like someone had tried to mark him and he'd survived it. When he saw me kneeling beside the cribs, something happened to his expression. Some calculation occurred behind his eyes. "Ms. Cooper," he said. His voice was lower than I expected. accented in a way that suggested he'd grown up speaking Italian, but chose to speak English now. "Thank you for coming." Rosa explained the situation. "I wanted to observe the children before we talked." He nodded, and the gesture seemed to satisfy him. He approached the cribs, and the twins responded immediately. Not with joy or comfort, but with recognition. Their bodies relaxed slightly. It was the smallest shift, but it was there. They recognized their father, and something in them knew they were safer when he was present. "They're beautiful," I said. And it was true. Despite everything they were carrying, they were beautiful in the way all babies are beautiful. Innocent and fragile, and already damaged in ways that should have been preventable. Giovanna wanted daughters and sons, Diego said quietly. He was looking at them, not at me. She was specific about wanting both. She got what she wanted. And then she was gone. Rafe met me in the mudroom with a binder whose spine had no label. Inside, the tabs were not colors, but verbs. Hardening, routing, clearing. The maps were aerial, the kind you buy from companies that pretend they are not sold to men like Diego. "We don't display power," Rafe said. "We make power boring." He traced a line from Sheridan to Green Bay Road, then to a street that changed its name every 4 blocks because towns like this prefer disguise to signage. 2-car convoy minimum, he repeated. Not for himself, for me. If someone ever asks why, you say it's about nap windows and lane changes. Both are timing problems. And he introduced the team without resumes. Lila, former EMT who did not like to be thanked. Harmon, who could drive backward faster than I could think forward. Ollie, who knew the names of every neighbor's dog because dogs are early warning systems. "Security is care," I said before I could stop myself. Rafe looked relieved, the way professionals look when you choose the word they would have chosen. "Good," he said. "Then you'll understand why the nursery door looks like wood and is not." I did. It weighed like a conversation you were trying to avoid. That afternoon, we practiced emergencies like theater. The babies slept through 2 drills and howled through the 3rd, which I marked as success. Rafe showed me the laminated checklists, car seats, go bag, pre-dialed contacts under names that meant nothing to anyone not already afraid. He did not ask me if I was afraid. He asked me if I could read a floor plan at a jog. I told him I could read anything at a jog. I have been running since I was 12. There was no dramatics in how he said it. Just facts. The kind of facts that a person delivers when emotion would be too dangerous to release. "How are you managing?" I asked. "I'm managing. Rosa helps. But neither of us can give them what they need. Sleep. Peace. The thing they had before. Which was their mother." He finally looked at me. "Can you help them?" I stood up. My knees were stiff from kneeling. "I don't know yet. I need time with them. I need to understand their patterns. I need to see them during the times when they're most distressed. Tonight," he said, "they have episodes beginning around 9 o'clock. They escalate through midnight. By 2 in the morning, they're usually exhausted enough to sleep for about an hour before the cycle begins again. Then I'll be here tonight." Something shifted in his face. Not quite relief. More like recognition that I was taking this seriously. "Rosa will show you to a room where you can rest during the day. I'll expect you back here at 8:30. He moved toward the door, then paused. "They need someone who sees them. Not the situation. Not their father. Them. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. "I can do that." After he left, I stood in the nursery and listened to the twins settle back into their vigilant waiting. Outside, the mansion was silent in a way that suggested silence was something that had been engineered. No traffic sounds. No neighbors. Just emptiness and wealth and 2 babies trying to survive their own grief. Rosa appeared to guide me to the guest room. It was larger than my apartment. The bed was the kind of bed that made you understand why some people considered sleep a luxury. But I didn't feel like sleeping. I felt like I'd just accepted something that was going to change the shape of my life. And I was standing at the threshold of that change trying to decide if I was brave or just desperate. By 8:30 that night, I was back in the nursery in clothes I'd changed into that afternoon. Fresh. Professional. Ready. The twins recognized me from the morning visit, and their recognition felt like a small victory, like maybe I was something their bodies had decided to accept. The first episode started at 9:17, Matteo began crying first, and his crying woke Julia. Not the kind of crying where babies need something, the kind where they're experiencing something they don't have language for. Panic. Terror. The physical memory of abandonment. I moved into the space between their cribs and began doing what I'd learned to do through years of working with traumatized children. I acknowledged the fear without minimizing it. I didn't offer solutions or try to stop the crying. I just existed in the same emotional space, validating that what they were feeling was real and significant, and that I could handle being present with it. And slowly, barely measurably, something shifted. 2 weeks became 18 days before anyone acknowledged that permanence was happening. The twins were sleeping better. Not perfectly, not through the night, but there was measurable change. The panic episodes were shorter. The periods of calm were longer. I had filled an entire notebook with observations about their patterns, their triggers, their small victories. Rosa found me in the kitchen on the morning of day 19. I was making tea for Julia, who had developed minor digestive issues related to her anxiety. Rosa didn't announce herself. She just appeared, which I was learning was her way. "The family would like to speak with you," she said. "Mr. Fioraldi is available now." My stomach tightened. Consultations ending on schedule usually meant they'd decided I wasn't helping, that the $20,000 had been spent, and now it was time to move on to the next specialist. I followed Rosa to Diego's office. I'd been inside it before, but only briefly. It was exactly what I'd expected. Minimalist. Expensive. Designed by someone who understood that true power doesn't need decoration. There were no photographs of Giovanna on the walls here, just like there weren't anywhere else in the house. It was as if she was being systematically erased from the physical space while remaining completely present in everything the space contained. Diego was sitting behind his desk when I entered, but he stood when he saw me. The gesture was old-fashioned in a way that suggested his mother had raised him with certain rules. "Ms. Cooper, please, sit." I sat. The chair was uncomfortable in a way that felt intentional. "The twins are improving," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. There's measurable progress. The sleep disturbance is still present, but the quality and duration are changing. The panic episodes are becoming more manageable." He nodded slowly. "You're different with them. Rosa told me that on the first night you sang to them, that you stayed between the cribs for hours without attempting to move them or change their environment. They needed presence, not intervention." "Exactly." He leaned back in his chair. "I'd like to make a formal proposal. I want you to stay, not as a consultant, as the primary caregiver for the twins during nighttime hours. Specifically, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 days a week initially, with flexibility based on how the arrangement works. At 3 a.m., the house became a classroom for small muscles. I ran a fingertip along the bridge of Matteo's nose, a downstroke that tells the eyes to agree with the dark. Julia's fists opened one finger at a time, like flowers on their worst day, still deciding to proceed. I narrated under my breath the way NICU nurses narrate to premature lungs. "Now we're lowering the dimmer," I said, and lowered it. "Now I'm moving the chair 2 inches back," and moved it. "Now I'm undoing one button on my cuff so you—" Diego stood in the doorway again, the chain a quiet parenthesis. "You talk them down from the ledge," he said. "There is no ledge," I answered. "There's only a nervous system asking the world to be less." He nodded like a man who could negotiate with men but not with neurons. "Tell me what I can carry," he said. I handed him the responsibility of doing nothing. He wore it like a coat that fit poorly at first, and then, slowly, perfectly. When sleep finally came, it arrived the way a weather change does in a city by the lake. You don't notice the first degree, only the 5th. I wrote it down on the back of the receipt. 14 minutes, then 23, then 41, until the numbers made a staircase we could climb without waking anyone. I felt my chest tighten in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. That would require me to leave my position at the hospital. I understand that. I also understand that the hospital doesn't own your time exclusively. You have options. The salary you're offering, I began carefully. It's significant. Too significant for someone to turn down rationally. I understand. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of the expensive bed in the expensive guest room and realized I'd just burned a bridge I'd spent 7 years building. The panic should have been worse. Instead, there was only a sense of rightness, like I'd been holding my breath and was finally allowed to exhale. That night, I went to the twins' nursery earlier than usual. Rosa had disappeared into whatever part of the house she occupied when the sun went down. The house was quiet in the way it always was. Like silence had been engineered into the architecture. Matteo and Julia were already showing signs of the evening anxiety. Their bodies were tense. Their movements were repetitive. They recognized night as the time when things became unstable. I was sitting between their cribs, talking quietly to them about nothing specific, when Diego appeared in the doorway. He didn't announce himself. He just stood there, watching me with his twins. "They'll sleep better tonight," he said. I looked up. "How do you know?" "Because you've decided to stay. They can feel it." I wanted to argue that babies couldn't read minds, that there was no way they could understand employment contracts or personal decisions. But as I looked at them, I noticed something. The tension in their small bodies had already begun to release. Imperceptibly, but measurably. Diego rubbed a palm over his jaw, calculation replacing fear. "You're right," he said. "Leaving would mark you as leverage. Staying makes you structure." "I told the hospital I need a leave of absence," I said. "At least 3 months." He nodded once, like this was exactly what he'd expected. "Thank you." Dr. Chandra's waiting room had a fish tank that solved nothing and whispered anyway. Matteo tried to sign for more with both hands at once, as if language could be multiplied by volume. Julia studied the pattern of light on the ceiling tiles and decided not to cry. "That's regulation," Dr. Chandra said later in the exam room, not looking at me but at the twins, like good detectives address the alibi and not the suspect. "Sleep is not a trick. It's a nervous system learning a grammar." She gave me a printout that wasn't a printout. It was a choreography. Response times, thresholds, acceptable abandon. Diego listened without interrupting, the way men listen when the instructions are finally about something that can be held. "There's nothing wrong with them that time won't teach," the doctor said. "There's nothing wrong with you that permission won't soften." On the way out, a mother with 3 kids under 5 touched my coat sleeve like I was a lighthouse. "How do you do it?" she asked. "We don't," I said. "We learn not to make the ocean larger than it is." In the car, the twins fell asleep in the way that is half physics, half surrender. Diego drove like speed was an apology. I told him the only apology that matters is repetition in the other direction. He laughed once. The sound felt like a new room opening in a familiar house. It was such a simple word. "Thank you." But the way he said it made it clear that he understood what I was sacrificing, what I was choosing, what I was accepting. He left the nursery, and I sat in the quiet and listened to the twins begin to settle. For the first time since arriving at this house, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not fear, not hesitation, recognition, acceptance of a change I couldn't reverse and didn't want to. Around 9 o'clock, just as the twins were finally achieving genuine sleep, there was a sound from outside. A siren, distant but growing closer. Then another. The frequency suggested something serious, something that required multiple emergency vehicles. Out by the lake, the wind did what it always does, change sides without warning, and the city followed. The siren stopped outside the gate. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Urgent. Multiple people moving with purpose. The kind of movement that comes from crisis, not routine. I kept my hands on both cribs, maintaining pressure so the twins would feel the continuity of my presence even in the disruption. Diego appeared in the doorway again, but he was different now. The controlled man from the office had been replaced by something more primal. "Stay with them, no matter what you hear. Don't move. Don't let them see you scared." "What's happening?" "Just stay. Keep them safe." He left, and I heard the front door open. Voices. Multiple men speaking in low tones about situations and locations and things I didn't understand. I focused on the twins, on keeping my breathing steady, on making sure they knew through every cell in my body that I was present and solid and would not abandon them. Hours passed. I don't know how many. The sirens eventually faded. The voices eventually stopped. But there was a quality of alteration in the house, like something had shifted in its foundational structure and would never quite realign the same way again. Around 2 a.m, Diego returned to the nursery. There was blood on his hands, but not on his clothes. His eyes were different, colder, like he'd just seen or done something that had required him to access parts of himself that were usually locked away. He looked at the twins, who were finally sleeping, and then at me. "Thank you for staying," he said quietly. "Where were you?" "Somewhere I needed to be." He left before I could ask more questions. I sat between the cribs through the rest of the night, understanding for the first time that the man who employed me was not someone who could be separated from the world that surrounded him. He was integral to something larger, something that reached into the night and demanded his presence and his violence. And I had agreed to stay anyway. The pattern became obvious around the 3rd week. Every morning, the twins would recognize me before they fully opened their eyes. Every evening, they would settle faster when I approached their cribs. The panic episodes that had stretched for hours in the beginning, now compressed into manageable segments. There was a rhythm forming, a structure that felt like something resembling stability. Rosa found me in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, while I was preparing the digestive tea for Julia. She moved with her usual quiet efficiency, never announcing herself, just appearing as if she'd materialized from the architecture itself. "Mr. Fioraldi would like to speak with you," she said. My chest tightened. Consultations that needed formal meetings usually meant endings. I followed her through corridors I'd stopped finding intimidating and into Diego's office. He was standing this time, which made the space feel smaller. He waited until Rosa closed the door before speaking. "The twins are different since you arrived," he said. Not a question, an observation. "They're adjusting. Children are resilient when they have consistent presence. You're not a consultant anymore. You haven't been for days." He stepped closer. "I want to formalize this arrangement. Stay as their primary caregiver, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 days a week to start, with flexibility depending on how things progress." I felt something shift in my abdomen. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. "That would require leaving my position at the hospital." "Yes. The salary you mentioned before still stands. Whatever amount you need, we can discuss it. Let me make the call," I said. My supervisor answered on the 2nd ring. I could hear the irritation in his voice before he spoke. "Ms. Cooper, we've been waiting to hear from you. When are you coming back? I need an extended personal leave of absence. Minimum 3 months, possibly longer." Rosa keeps a ledger that no one asked her to keep. It is not numbers, or not only that. It is units of relief. 1 page for ounces of formula that didn't end in reflux. 1 page for minutes of sleep that arrived before the night got its hands all the way around us. 1 page for words not said in hallways where anger fits like a glove. Every row has a date and a note in the margin. Julia reached for Mateo's sleeve before she fell asleep, as if proof of tenderness might be required later and she intends to have receipts. I found the ledger once on the counter and closed it before I read anything that could change how I look at her. "You can read it," she said, catching the motion. "It makes the days add up to something other than laundry." So I read the page titled simply, "Things That Worked." It wasn't tricks. It was the world made smaller. Fewer lights, lower voices, 1 song instead of 4, sung worse but truer. At the bottom of the page she had written, "We are learning to be boring," which is another word for safe. That night I sang the same song 3 times, off-key, because the twins do not reward accuracy. Rosa stood in the hall, listening like a person who trusts what she hears more than what people say. "It's quieter," she whispered. "Or you are," I said. "Maybe both." The silence that followed lasted too long. "Madison, we discussed this. The hospital can't operate on a skeleton crew indefinitely. If you leave, we can't hold your position." "I understand." "Do you? Do you understand that you're abandoning colleagues who depend on you? Do you understand that you're throwing away 7 years of institutional knowledge and reputation?" I did understand. I also understood that the fluorescent lights had been dimming for me for a long time. That every pediatric patient I saw was starting to feel like Sarah Vega, impossible to save. That my mother had worked 70-hour weeks her entire life, and I still hadn't made enough money to let her stop. "I'm sorry," I said. I need to do this. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of the guest bed in the expensive room and realized I'd just severed something that had structured my entire adult life. The panic I expected didn't come. Instead, there was only a sensation of inevitability, like I'd been walking toward this moment for years and was finally allowing myself to arrive at it. That night, I went to the twins earlier than usual. Rosa had prepared everything. The room was at perfect temperature. The white noise machine was running at consistent volume. The lighting was dimmed to that specific shade that indicated sleep was approaching. I'd begun to notice these details, the way the house adjusted itself around the twins' needs. I was sitting between their cribs when Diego appeared. He didn't knock. He simply arrived, the way people do when they own the space completely. You told them? He asked. Yes. I need a 3-month leave minimum. He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he'd already calculated. Thank you. It was such a simple word, but the weight behind it made clear that he understood what I was sacrificing, what I was choosing, what I was accepting by staying in this mansion with his twins and the aura of violence that surrounded him. They need you, he said. I know. And He stopped himself. The moment stretched between us like something physical. I'm grateful that you're here. He left before I could respond, and the room returned to its careful silence. Mateo had already begun to doze. Julia was following, her small body relaxing incrementally. I kept my hands on both cribs, maintaining pressure so they would feel continuity even in sleep. The days that followed blended together in a way that was both disorienting and grounding. My role in the household crystallized. I wasn't a guest anymore. I was a fixture. Rosa began leaving detailed notes about the twins' dietary preferences and sleep patterns. The household staff started addressing me with the respect usually reserved for permanent positions. There was furniture moved to the guest room to make it feel more like living quarters than temporary accommodation. Diego began appearing more frequently in the nursery in the evenings. Not every night, but often enough that it became pattern. He would sit in the chair by the window and watch me work with his children. There was something almost meditative about his observation, like he was learning something essential by watching someone else care for what he loved most. One evening, around midnight, he spoke while the twins were sleeping. My mother is still in Italy. She doesn't know about Giovanna yet. I haven't found the words to tell her that her grandchildren don't have a mother. I didn't look up from my notebook where I was recording sleep patterns. You could tell her that they have someone now. Someone? Me. I'm here, consistently. That counts for something. He was quiet for a long time. It counts for everything. I finally looked at him. There was something raw in his expression, like he was allowing me to see something usually kept locked behind careful control. Rosa told me you declined the guest room upgrade, he said. The room is fine. The room is a closet masquerading as a guest space. Rosa has been acquiring furniture, a better bed, shelving, a desk. It's in a storage room waiting for you to approve it. I don't need. Not need. I want to. There's a difference. I closed my notebook. Why? Because you're staying. Permanently, I want you to have space that reflects that. The words hung between us. Permanently. It was a long time since anyone had used that word in relation to me. A long time since I'd allowed myself to imagine staying anywhere long enough for it to matter. Okay, I said quietly. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. Thank you for choosing to stay. For choosing them. For choosing this. After he left, I sat in the nursery and realized that I'd made a choice that couldn't be unmade. That the life I'd known before this house, the apartment, the hospital, the structured isolation, was now firmly behind me, that I was building something here with these 2 babies and their complicated father that had the weight of permanence. Outside, the city continued its endless noise. Inside the mansion, there was only the soft breathing of sleeping twins and the sound of my own acceptance of a future I couldn't have predicted and wouldn't have chosen, but was choosing anyway. The grocery store didn't know it was part of an experiment in normal. My mother examined beans like they could tell her where the year had gone. They trusted you to arrange all this? She asked, meaning the house, the schedule, the way the chaos had lanes now. They trusted me to make ordinary happen, I said. She put one bag back, took another. Old habits keep their own calendars. The security detail pretended to be interested in cereal. My mother pretended not to notice. At the register, she counted bills even though I had a card that could have ended the conversation faster. Speed is not dignity, she said. Outside, the air had the damp weight of snow thinking about itself. She tucked her hand into my elbow the way she used to when we crossed streets with broken lights. You said once you'd buy me time, she murmured. I was late, I said. But I brought change. Change is better than flowers, she said. And the sky decided to agree in a soft fall that made the car look like an apology someone kept meaning to make. Diego carried the bags like proof that strength can be quiet. In the back seat, the twins dreamed with their mouths open, which is how I know the body is not guarding the exit. The fourth day without Diego felt like standing in a room where all the air had been removed. The twins could sense it. I could sense it. Even Rosa moved through the mansion differently, with a tension in her jaw that suggested she was managing something beyond my understanding. Day 1 of his absence, I told myself it was business. Day 2, I began tracking their deterioration. Day 3, their panic episodes returned with an intensity that suggested they'd regressed weeks in progress. Day 4, I understood that whatever had pulled him away had consequences that rippled through the entire household. Rosa appeared in the nursery around midnight on day 4. She was carrying fresh linens, but her movements were different, more urgent, more aware that something fundamental had shifted. The children are struggling, she said quietly. They sense his absence. I didn't look up from Mateo, whose breathing was elevated even in sleep. Babies understand absence better than we give them credit for. They feel the vacancy in the structure they've come to depend on. He'll return tonight. How do you know? Because that's what he does. He leaves. He handles what needs handling. He comes back. She replaced the linens and left before I could ask what exactly needed handling. But I had begun to understand what the mansion really was. Not just a residence for a wealthy family. A base of operations. The carefully positioned men. The coded communications I'd see people receiving through earpieces. The way certain rooms were accessed only with specific protocols. The documents I'd glimpsed that mentioned territories and operations and families I didn't recognize. Around 2 a.m, I heard the vehicles. Multiple. The gate opening. Footsteps in the corridor that suggested urgency. I kept my hands on both cribs, maintaining pressure so the twins would feel continuity even in disruption. Diego appeared in the doorway, and I recognized immediately that something had fractured in him. There was blood on his hands. Not dripping. Not enough to suggest he'd been injured. Enough to suggest other people had been. He looked at the twins. Then at me. How are they? Difficult. They know something's wrong. He washed his hands in the small sink in the nursery corner. The water ran red initially, then gradually cleared. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. There's something you need to understand, he said quietly. Something I should have told you before I allowed you to stay. I waited. My family isn't simple. Our business isn't simple. There are rivals. Families that want what we have. Territory, power, influence. For years I've maintained balance through calculation and controlled response. But recently, that balance has begun to fracture. He turned to face me, and his eyes were different. Colder. Like he'd accessed parts of himself that were usually locked away. The Versiani family has been testing our boundaries. Subtly, carefully, but consistently. Today, we discovered why. We have a cousin, Francesco. He grew up as my brother. I trusted him completely. We discovered he's been providing information to Versiani. Specific information. Our operations. Our movements. Our vulnerabilities. My chest tightened. More importantly, Diego continued, he provided information about my children. About you. Versiani suggested that the twins could be useful as leverage if things escalated. That you could be useful. The room suddenly felt smaller. The walls pressing inward. The twins in their cribs were innocent of all this, but they were still at the center of it. You need to leave, Diego said. No, you don't understand what this means. What could happen? I understand exactly what it means. I stood up. If I leave now, Versiani knows I'm a separation point. They know that removing me creates fracture in your structure. They know it makes the twins less stable, makes you less focused. Me leaving is exactly what they want. Me leaving proves that I can be leveraged. He was quiet. If I stay, I continued, I'm part of the structure. I'm not a weak point. I'm integrated. That changes the calculation. You'd be in danger. I'm in danger whether I stay or leave. At least if I stay, the children have continuity. He looked at me for a long moment. There was something in his expression that shifted. Something that recognized I was making a choice with full knowledge of what that choice meant. Okay, he said finally. The word hung between us like a vow. Francesco? I asked. Handled. He's made arrangements to relocate to Italy. He understands that his presence here creates an unacceptable vulnerability in our perimeter. He also understands the cost of betrayal. And Versiani. Still testing, still calculating. But now they know that we know they have an infiltrator. That changes the game. He sat in the chair by the window, the one where he often watched me with the twins. He looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. Thank you for not leaving, he said. Thank you for being honest. The twins slept through the night, completely, uninterrupted, like they'd sensed that Diego was back and that stability had been restored, at least temporarily. Antonella stayed 2 weeks and arranged the kitchen like a map of a city she had left, but not forgiven. She cooked by gesture and memory, measuring salt with the first joint of her index finger, tasting sauces with a wooden spoon that might have been older than my certainty. You cook like someone told you to be precise, she said to me, not unkind. Precision is how poor girls keep the lights on, I answered. She nodded as if I had passed a test she had not announced. At night she told stories of Naples where loyalty is a noun you can touch and debt is what you owe to the people who carried your furniture up 5 flights without asking which floor you could afford. She wore a thin gold chain and never took it off, not even to sleep. On her last day, she pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. Not for value, she said. For weight. I understood. Some jewelry is a reminder that gravity still applies. When she left, the house held the smell of tomatoes and a lesson about staying that no one had written down. The babies slept 11 minutes longer than usual, which in our currency is interest accrued. Around 4 a.m, he spoke again. There's something else you should know. Something I've been avoiding. What? The way you've become necessary to them. To me. That's not something I can protect you from. That's not something I can control or manage. You matter now in ways that complicate everything. I sat down across from him. That's the point of staying, isn't it? To matter in ways that can't be easily removed or managed. He nodded slowly. Yes. That's exactly the point. When the sun came up, the mansion had returned to its careful silence. The twins were resting peacefully. Diego had finally allowed himself to sleep in the chair by the window, and I understood that I had just crossed a threshold that couldn't be recrossed, that whatever protection or distance I'd maintained was now gone, that I was genuinely part of this family's structure now, for better or worse, through whatever came next. The weeks following Francesco's departure blurred together in ways that felt intentional, like Diego had orchestrated time itself to move differently within the mansion's walls. It was no longer a place where I was waiting for something to begin. It had already begun. I just hadn't found all the words yet to describe what exactly it was. The small gestures accumulated first. Coffee appeared in the kitchen every morning at 6:15, made precisely the way I'd observed myself making it during the 2nd week I stayed. Not the way Rosa made it. Not the way anyone else would make it. The way I made it, with the water temperature adjusted slightly lower, the grounds measured with meticulous attention, the timing exact. Diego had watched me enough to understand my preferences, and then integrated them into his household, like they'd always belonged there. I discovered this on a Tuesday morning when I came down earlier than usual, unable to sleep, because Matteo had been restless through the night, and found the kitchen already arranged like a stage set designed specifically for me. The coffee was still warm. The mug was on the counter. There was even a small pitcher of the oat milk I'd mentioned casually 3 weeks prior in passing conversation with Rosa. When I asked about it, Diego simply said, "You take care of my children." It seemed logical to take care of what you need. But it wasn't logical. It was intimate. There's a difference between logic and the knowledge that someone has watched you carefully enough to understand how you like your coffee, and then chose to provide it without being asked. That's not logic. That's attention. That's recognition. The notes I started leaving about infant formulas and calming techniques initially felt professional. They were observations about Mateo's digestive sensitivity and recommendations for herbal supplements that might support Julia's sleep cycle. But slowly they became something else. They became a conversation without words. I would leave a note suggesting chamomile tea steeped at specific temperatures. The next morning, Diego would have prepared exactly that amount in a glass container in the refrigerator, labeled with the date and time of preparation. Rosa watched this exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between satisfaction and resignation, like she'd been waiting for exactly this to happen, and was now witnessing its inevitable unfoldment. By the 4th week, the library had become our space. Not deliberately claimed, just naturally occupied. After the twins were asleep, after their evening anxieties had settled, and their small bodies had finally surrendered to rest, I would find myself drawn downstairs to the library instead of retreating to my room. And Diego would already be there, working on something at the large table, laptop open, documents spread with the kind of organization that suggested military precision. He never asked me to come. I never announced my arrival. There was simply a moment where I decided to descend the stairs, and simultaneously, there he was, as if we'd communicated through some invisible frequency that didn't require words. I would sit in the leather chair across from him, and we would exist in profound silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind where two people are present together but pursuing separate paths. He would work. I would read or review my clinical notes about the twins' progress. Hours would pass. No conversation. No touch. Nothing but the sound of pages turning and the weight of his occasional glance when he would pause from whatever occupied his attention. There was a night, around the 5th week, when he stopped working entirely and simply watched me for an extended period. I was reading an article about infant trauma responses, and his observation was so sustained that I eventually lowered the paper. "What?" I asked. "You're different now," he said. "Different how? When you arrived, you were guarded. Every interaction calculated. You were a professional maintaining distance. Now you just exist here. You don't maintain anything anymore." I didn't respond immediately. He was right. Somewhere between the first panic episode and now, I had stopped performing professionalism and had simply become present. The twins needed me to stop performing. I said finally, "It's not just them." The statement hung between us, and there was a moment where I could have redirected the conversation, could have maintained the professional boundary that had been dissolving gradually. Instead, I stayed silent and acknowledged what we both understood. The legal work came in a stack like weather advisories, guardianship contingencies, healthcare proxies, a life insurance policy with beneficiaries who had to be named in code because the world reads where it shouldn't. We signed in a room with a table that reflected our faces back at us like we were all defendants in something we hadn't agreed to be charged with. The lawyer's pen sounded like an insect wearing heels. "This is for when we are tired," Diego said, flipping a page to the tab that meant worst case. "This is for when we are surprised," I said, initialing beside a clause about temporary custody if air travel ever became necessary without warning. The notary did not look bored, which is the highest compliment you can pay to fear. When it was done, we filed the papers in a drawer that looked like a drawer and wasn't. Rafe labeled it with a word that meant nothing. Linens. On the way out, Diego touched the small of my back in a way that said the future had not been canceled, only rescheduled. "I know," I said. He nodded once and returned to his work, but something had shifted. The unspoken had been briefly acknowledged, and that acknowledgement changed the texture of everything that followed. By week 6, I had stopped sleeping in the guest room that Rosa had outfitted with better furniture. It wasn't a deliberate decision. It evolved through incremental choices. One night, the twins were having difficulty with their sleep cycle, and I brought them both to Diego's bedroom because it was more spacious, because there was room for me to sit between their portable sleep spaces, because something about the presence of their father seemed to calm them more effectively than anything else I could offer. Diego didn't question the arrangement. He simply worked at his desk in the corner, keeping himself present but not intrusive. When the twins finally fell asleep around midnight, he asked if I wanted to stay. It wasn't a proposition. It was a practical question about logistics. Yes, I said. So I stayed. And I kept staying. Some nights the twins weren't present, and it was just Diego and me in the substantial space of his bedroom, maintaining a distance that felt significant, even though we were sharing the same bed. There was no sexual contact. There was barely any physical contact at all. But there was intimacy in a way that I was beginning to understand transcended the physical. We would lie in the darkness and talk about things that didn't require solutions. He spoke about his childhood in Italy, about his mother, about the moment he understood that his family's business was something he couldn't escape rather than something he'd chosen. I spoke about my mother, about the guilt of not having provided her with the life I'd promised myself I would give her, about the moment I realized that my career had become a way of avoiding genuine connection rather than facilitating it. "You're different with them," he said one night, while the twins slept between us, their small bodies rising and falling with the regularity of functioning peace. "Different how? You're not trying to fix them. You're just allowing them to be broken, and you're staying anyway. That's what they needed," I said. "Someone to stay with the broken parts, instead of trying to repair them immediately." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that shifted everything. "I love you." Not as a confession. Not as something he'd been building toward. Just a statement. A fact. Delivered with the same certainty he used for everything else. I didn't respond immediately. The words deserved more than immediate acceptance. They deserved acknowledgement that what he was expressing was something that complicated everything we'd carefully maintained. "I know," I finally said. "Is that enough?" "For now," I said. "But I need to say it back eventually. When I'm ready to mean it completely. When I'm certain that I'm choosing this and not just accepting it." He nodded like he understood completely. Like he'd expected nothing else from someone like me. Someone who'd spent her entire life maintaining professional distance. Who'd never allowed herself to be needed. Who'd finally found something that required her to surrender all the armor she'd constructed. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." And I understood that he meant it. Not as a promise. As a statement of fact. He was integrated into my life in a way that made leaving impossible. And I was integrated into his, in a way that made distance impossible. We were bound now through something larger than choice. Through the daily accumulation of small moments that had created dependency that was entirely voluntary and entirely irreversible. The twins slept between us, their breathing synchronized, their small hands occasionally reaching toward each other in their sleep. This was my family now. Not by blood, by choice. By daily decision to stay in a place that terrified me and completed me simultaneously. By April, my mother's shifts lived only in daylight. She started saying retirement without laughing afterward, like a door had been unlocked from the inside. The incident with the car happened on a Tuesday afternoon when the weather was threatening rain, and I was beginning to understand that rain was always a precursor to something changing in this house. Rosa was supposed to be at the market. Simple errand. 2 hours maximum. She left around 2 in the afternoon while I was with the twins in the nursery, working through their afternoon feeding schedule. The twins were learning to eat solid foods, and it was a process that required patience and attention, watching for signs of digestive comfort or distress. I was cleaning Julia's face when Diego appeared in the doorway. Not unusual anymore. He frequently checked on the children during daylight hours, taking breaks from whatever occupied his attention in the office. But there was something in his expression that was different. Controlled panic. The kind of fear that someone with his level of training learns to hide, but can never completely eliminate. "Where is Rosa?" he asked. "Market. She should return within the hour." He was already moving toward his phone, making calls in a language I didn't fully understand. Italian mixed with rapid-fire instructions. I heard the word Verziani mentioned twice. That was enough to tell me something had happened. 20 minutes later, Rosa returned and she was shaking. Not visibly, but I could see the tremor in her hands as she removed her coat. I could see the way she gripped the edge of the counter like she needed something solid to anchor her. What happened? I asked. A car, she said quietly, at the intersection near the market. They recognized me. They accelerated. If the driver hadn't reacted, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Diego appeared, and his expression had solidified into something crystalline and dangerous. He looked at Rosa and then at me, and I understood immediately what he was thinking. "We need to talk," he said to me, privately. I followed him to the office. The room felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing inward with the weight of something inevitable. He closed the door and moved to the window, looking out at the manicured grounds like they held answers. "This ends," he said. "You need to leave. Tonight." "No. Madison. No," I said again. "You're thinking reactively, and I understand why, but you're thinking wrong." He turned to face me, and there was fury in his expression. "They tried to hit Rosa. They made a statement. They want you to know they can reach anyone close to you, which is exactly why I can't leave. You're not listening." "I am listening. I'm listening to someone in fear trying to protect what he loves by removing variables. But I'm not a variable to be managed. If you send me away, you prove to Verziani that I'm a weakness. You prove that separation works as a strategy. You prove that I can be isolated and therefore used." He moved to his desk, hands gripping the edge like he needed to physically restrain himself from something. "If something happens to you, if something happens to me, it happens because I stayed and made myself part of the structure. Not because I was removed like a puzzle piece you didn't want in play anymore." The silence that followed was substantial. I could see him processing, calculating, understanding that I was right, even though he didn't want me to be right. "What are you suggesting?" he asked finally. "Formalize it," I said. "Make it official that I'm not an employee or a consultant or someone who can be easily removed. Make me family. Make me yours in a way that changes the calculation for anyone thinking about leverage." He looked at me like I'd proposed something radical, and I suppose I had. "You understand what you're asking," he said. "Yes, I do. There's no going back from that. I know." He was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and made calls. Not to security. Not to people who handled threats. To people who handled ceremonies. To people who bore witness to declarations of commitment within the structure of his world. By evening, the house had transformed. Not dramatically. There were no decorations or flowers. Nothing that would suggest celebration to someone observing from outside. But there was a formality in how the household staff moved, an awareness that something significant was occurring within the mansion's walls. Rosa appeared in my room around 7 o'clock. She'd cleaned herself of the afternoon's trauma and now moved with restored composure. She carried clothing. "For the ceremony," she said. It wasn't a question whether I wanted to participate. It was assumption that I understood this was happening. The dress was simple, elegant, ivory-colored. Nothing like a wedding dress, but there was ceremony in its simplicity. When I was dressed, Rosa guided me to a room I'd never been in before. It was a library within the mansion, smaller than the main library, more intimate. There were perhaps 15 people present. Men, mostly, people who worked for Diego in capacities I didn't fully understand. A few women, and my mother. I stopped moving when I saw her. She was sitting in the front, tears already streaming down her face, her hands pressed together like a prayer. She looked older than I remembered her from just weeks ago. Or maybe I was seeing her clearly for the first time in years, without the filter of guilt and obligation. Diego was there. He wore a dark suit tailored to perfection, but his expression was uncertain in a way I'd never seen before, like he was about to cross a threshold that would change him permanently. Rosa guided me forward to where he stood. There was no officiant, no legal structure, no government recognition. This was something else entirely. This was declaration made before witnesses who understood what it meant within the world we inhabited. Diego took my hand. His hand was warm, solid, real in a way that everything in my former life had never been. "I want you to know what this is," he said, speaking clearly so everyone could hear. "This is a declaration that Madison Cooper is part of this family, that she's not an employee or someone external, that anything directed toward her is directed toward me. That she's protected not because she works for me, but because she belongs to me. And I belong to her. He reached into his pocket and produced a ring. Gold. Simple. With a symbol engraved into the band. He placed it on my finger. "I'm yours," I said, because it seemed like the appropriate response, because it was the only true thing I could say in that moment. Around us, the men nodded. It was acknowledgement. Acceptance. Recognition of a change in status that would ripple through whatever network Diego operated within. My mother approached when the ceremony concluded. She took my face in her hands and looked at me like she was trying to understand who I'd become. "Are you happy?" she asked in Portuguese. The question was fundamental. Not asking about safety or security or any of the practical things. Just asking if I was happy. "Yes," I said, and I meant it completely. "Then I'm happy too," she said. Even though I don't understand any of this. Later that night, after my mother had been driven home with assurances of care and protection, after the house had settled back into its careful silence, Diego and I were in his bedroom, our bedroom now. The distinction mattered. He set a mug beside my notes, the oat milk already whisked in, gratitude phrased in temperature. "Thank you for asking me to stay," I replied. The twins were asleep in their portable cribs. Tomorrow they would be moved into their own room on a permanent basis as part of the structural shift of the household. But tonight, they were here, between us, part of the unit we'd become. I understood that morning would bring a sudden septic shock from an undiagnosed infection, that Versiani would respond to this formalization in ways we couldn't predict, that the choice I'd made to stay had consequences that would unfold across weeks and months. But in that moment, lying beside Diego with the twins sleeping nearby and a ring on my finger that marked me as something other than an outsider, I felt a kind of peace that I'd never experienced before. This was my family now. Not by blood, by choice. By daily accumulation of moments that had bound us together in ways that couldn't be unbound. By a decision to stay when leaving would have been simpler. 4 months into the new arrangement, the mansion had stopped feeling like a fortress and started feeling like a home. Not because the security had been removed or the reality of Diego's world had changed. It simply meant that I'd stopped seeing the protective structures as walls and had started seeing them as the perimeter of something sacred that needed defending. The twins were thriving in ways that seemed almost impossible to measure in conventional metrics. Mateo had begun making sounds that approximated words. Julia had started laughing with genuine delight when Diego would return from his daily activities. More importantly, they slept through most nights now without incident. The panic episodes had become rare. When they occurred, they were manageable, responded to with the consistency of presence rather than the desperation of early intervention. My mother had integrated into the household in unexpected ways. Rosa had arranged for her to work in the mansion's administration, rather than continuing her work as a housekeeper in other people's homes. She managed the household staff, coordinated with vendors, handled logistics that didn't require me to be present. For the first time in her life, she was working reasonable hours. She'd even started talking about retirement, a concept that had been theoretical before but now felt possible. The library had become my favorite space. Not for the books, though there were excellent ones. For the evidence of Diego's life displayed between the shelves. There were photographs here that didn't exist elsewhere in the house. Pictures of him as a child in Italy. Images of his mother, Antonella. Documentation of his evolution from someone's son into someone's father, into someone's husband. It was in the library that Antonella arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. She was smaller than I'd expected, which somehow surprised me, given that I'd never expected anything specific. Her hair was white, pinned back with the same precision that Rosa employed. She moved through the mansion like she was reclaiming territory that belonged to her by birthright. Diego had warned me she was coming. He'd explained that his mother would want to meet me, would want to assess whether her son had made a choice that honored his family's legacy. He'd also explained that Antonella held power in ways that weren't obvious until you were standing in front of her. When we met in the library, she took my hand and held it. Not in greeting, in assessment. She examined my ring, noted the symbol, acknowledged what it represented. "You understand what you're part of?" she asked in Italian-accented English. I'm learning, I said honestly. Good. Understanding is better than innocence. Innocence breaks too easily. She stayed for 2 weeks. She spent time with the twins in ways that suggested she'd been waiting for grandchildren her entire life. She cooked traditional Italian foods in the mansion's kitchen, filling the space with aromas that had no precedent here. She watched Diego interact with me and nodded once, a gesture that apparently constituted approval. On her final evening, we had dinner together as an extended family. My mother, Antonella, Diego, the twins in their high chairs, Rosa overseeing everything with her characteristic efficiency. It was the closest thing to normal family dinner that I'd ever experienced. Antonella raised her glass. To family, she said. Not made by blood, but by choice and commitment. My son has chosen well. My grandchildren have what they need. This is good. She left the next morning, but not before telling me that she expected reports. Photographs of the twins. Information about their development. She'd made me promise to bring them to Italy in 2 years, when they were old enough to travel and remember the journey. The promise felt significant, like I was being woven permanently into a structure that transcended the mansion's walls. One evening, after the twins had been settled into their own room permanently, after they'd learned to sleep through the night without panic, after the routines had solidified into genuine comfort, Diego found me in the library reading clinical articles about infant trauma recovery. You've stopped documenting them, he observed. They don't need clinical observation anymore. They need normal childhood. You could go back to the hospital, he said. Rosa mentioned it months ago. You could work as a consultant, help other children the way you help them. I set down my article. Would you want me to? What I want doesn't matter. What matters is what you need. I considered this. The truth was that I didn't miss the hospital. I didn't miss the fluorescent lights or the emergency protocols or the cycles of saving some children and losing others. I had found something here that felt more aligned with who I actually was, rather than who I'd been trained to be. I'm going to do something different, I said. Rosa mentioned that there are families in Chicago who deal with similar situations. Children who've experienced loss, whose parents don't have access to someone like me because of their circumstances. I want to work with those families. Provide guidance without judgment. He nodded like this was exactly what he'd expected. I can help with that. Access, resources, connections. Whatever you need. I know you can. That night, lying beside him with the twins asleep in their own room down the hall, I realized that I'd stopped counting the days since I arrived. The temporal distance between that phone call and this moment had become irrelevant. I existed now in a continuous present, where the life I was living felt like the only life I'd ever actually inhabited. I love you, I said. The words had been waiting a long time. I'd said them mentally hundreds of times, but speaking them aloud felt like removing the final barrier. He didn't respond immediately. He simply held me closer, and I understood that he already knew. Had known for months. Had been waiting for me to arrive at the knowledge myself. Outside, Chicago continued its endless patterns. Somewhere in the city, there were families struggling with what we'd already overcome. Children experiencing loss, parents drowning in the weight of responsibility. But inside the mansion, there was peace. There was structure. There was a family that had been built deliberately, piece by piece, through choices that had terrified me and completed me simultaneously. This was my life now. Not the one I'd planned. Not the one I'd anticipated when that phone call came through on a night when I was covered in someone else's tragedy. But it was real. It was mine. And I would defend it with the same ferocity that Diego defended everything he loved, because I'd finally learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is choose to stay.